It seemed that from his first creation there had been planted a seed of evil in the heart of man, and from this, the greatest plant to sprout forth was greed. With history as its testament, greed holds a remarkable, chilling grip on the course of human interaction, and perhaps there is no greater indicator of this truth than the 19th century British-Chinese opium trade. Lingering as a dark stain on the British legacy, the trade had been initiated to reap profit and to fulfill British interests at the expense of the Chinese. In a sense, Britain had compromised their morality for wealth, defying not only their own cultural parameters, but challenging the moral principles and traditions of the Chinese. By 1785, Britain was importing 15 million pounds of tea per year from China. The trade hardly benefited Britain. British demand for Chinese goods was high, while the Chinese demand for British manufacturers was low. As a result, huge deficits sprung up on the British side, and they were forced to make them up in silver. A drain of silver perpetuated, and British coffers were sucked dry, as China benefited at an unprecedented degree. Britain desperately searched for some way to turn the trade in their favor, first by opening up Chinese ports.
In a way, England wanted tea, China, handicrafts, and even agricultural produce, whereas China didn't want anything from England. So silver flowed from England to China. The people were deeply concerned.
Britain had spearheaded the European attempt to open Chinese borders. The new industrialized Britain sought new markets, but above all sought the untapped riches of China. Britain desired China's exotic imports and had a distinct penchant for Chinese tea. During the 1760s, the value of tea exceeded the value of all British imports, and Britain had established a trade with China so that it could satisfy this demand. In 1792, Britain had sent Lord Macartney along with an expedition to persuade the Chinese into opening up ports. But flattery, diplomacy, and gifts did not impress the court, and when Macartney refused to kowtow to Emperor Qianlong, all British requests were swiftly denied. Emperor Qianlong made it perfectly clear that China had no interest in British manufactures. Opium was a product that was not produced in China, and that the Chinese would buy endlessly. Opium could thoroughly make up the difference in silver that had accumulated in China's favor. Once the entire Chinese nation was addicted, they would become permanent customers of British opium. And with the opportune weakness of the Manchu state, it would be relatively easy to introduce this item into Chinese markets. The dangerous, addictive properties of opium had been known in China for centuries, and thus the Chinese government outlawed it in 1731. Unfortunately, the laws were neither enforced nor articulated. Britain could introduce Bengalese opium into China in massive amounts, and the government would take little notice. In India, the poppy was grown and refined into opium for use in China. Private merchants would carry the opium aboard their ships to Canton. Professional smugglers operating along the coast were hired by the British East India Company, who maintained a monopoly on the trade. An underground system based on bribery allowed opium to safely make its way into Chinese hands. Steadily, the opium trade began to take the form of a lucrative enterprise initiated by British entrepreneurs. Opium was a very damaging component for the Chinese. Most Chinese men were users and had a life expectancy of about 20 years from their first smoke. Most addicts would be dead by age 50. Upwards of 3 million and growing Chinese were users, concentrated in the male working population. Opium had a dehumanizing factor as well. When one man became addicted, he would use his wages to buy more opium. Families were forced to suffer because of a man's addiction. Opium use diffused upwards to officers, soldiers, and officials, and became the seed of corruption in a society whose very roots were entwined with morality. What Britain was doing seemed unthinkable in the eyes of the Chinese. When foreigners initiated a systematic trade to sell opium to China's people, the Chinese were thoroughly and justly outraged. Confucian culture was not compatible with British economic motives, and thus the cultural clash spawned resentment between both sides. There were so many British imports into China that the country became the leading exporter of silver to pay for British opium. By 1836, China's silver was drained thoroughly, crippling its economy. With the help of opium, Britain had turned the tables, and it was China that was being forced to make up the deficit, while Britain was endlessly enriched from this perverse exchange. It was wealth that perpetuated the vicious cycle ensuing in China. It was wealth that watered the poppy flower, so that it could one day become opium, ready for sale and consumption for one of 3 million addicts in China.
Maybe the opium turned out to be an excuse for something much deeper. That is the opening up of China for trade, and in a more realistic sense for domination and control.
Lord Palmerston, British Minister of Foreign Trade at the time, confirms British motives in an 1848 speech to Parliament.
We have not eternal allies, and we have not perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow.
With Palmerston's words, that Britain acted purely on the basis of wealth is almost unquestionable. If eternal and perpetual interests are the only force that drives a nation, no bounds exist to fetter what ends they will go to follow them. But even such material motives were not the only cause of the ensuing conflict. When the British reached the shores of China, they encountered something they had never encountered before. They found an extremely different culture, one whose ideas could not coexist with those of the West. Most notable was the sentiment commonly known as the Middle Kingdom Syndrome. China imposed isolation on itself, and as a result, remained largely ignorant. They were unaware of the changes in power and ideas taking place outside of their kingdom, a dangerous error which would force them to pay the consequences in the years to come.
Now, normally, if a culture or person of culture is ignorant about what's going on, it's pardonable, it's excusable, understandable. If ignorance is also combined with arrogance, we're ignorant of the outside world and we believe the outside world is so inferior to us, that is fatal. This is what happened to the Qing dynasty. Already China, scientifically, technologically, militarily, institutionally, China was very much behind the West. This combination of ignorance and arrogance made China incapable of responding to what actually happens.
In the end, China turned to a young governor-general named Lin Zexu to change the tide. Lin executed several plans to weaken the influence of opium at home and abroad, demean British merchants, and strengthen prohibition laws. His most famous acts are his letter to Queen Victoria, in which he condemns Britain's wicked scheme, and his public seizure and burning of 20,000 chests of opium. Even if his actions did not entirely defeat the trade, he still won praise and legacy amongst the Chinese people for his determination to show Britain that China would not and could not go down without a fight. But it was clear that these two countries, so different and thrown in so tense a situation, were likely to clash. The clash would come in 1839, amidst Lin's conduct of opium prohibition in China. Charles Eliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, advised British merchants to leave for Almen. In late 1839, drunken British sailors killed a Chinese farmer. Eliot refused to hand over the culprits, and Lin, in response, pressured Portuguese authorities to drive out the British presence. Shortly after, the First Battle of the Opium War was fought, and Britain's superior vessels demolished 3 Chinese war junks. War was declared, and an expedition was soon sent from Britain to engage the Chinese. British modern tactics and technology easily destroyed the Chinese forces, and in roughly 2 years, Britain subdued China. The compromise that followed was the first of a series of unequal treaties, in which Britain reaped rights, while China was left with nothing to rebuild its country. The Treaty of Nanking ended the war on August 29, 1842, and had several provisions. First, China owed Britain an indemnity of $21 million to pay for the war and opium. 5 Chinese ports would be open to foreign trade. Hong Kong would be ceded to Britain, and China was to recognize the equality between the two nations. The confrontation over opium represented a much larger conflict between 2 very prominent yet very different countries. For the Chinese, it was moral force that drove them. However, it was also their sense of superiority as well as ignorance that led them to decline and eventually defeat. For the British, it was the pursuit of markets, expansion, and trading rights that led them to undertake the opium trade and to destroy the lives of millions of Han Chinese without conscience. The sheer incompatibility of such ideas, of money and morality, culminated in a devastating conflict, and what we learn from the 19th century opium trade and war is that these two nations, on opposite sides of the globe, of opposite ideas and values, were bound to collide at one time or another, and that opium was simply the catalyst of this seemingly inevitable conflict.